So by the time we get to Chen's work on glossy magazines in contemporary China, it's pretty obvious why she does this research. It's part of a global theme on how women's media relates to the changing economic and social status of women across the globe. So she's immediately got an audience for that. And the fascinating thing about this particular piece of research, which I think is really fantastic piece of work, is that it's able to take this general theme. We know that there is an interest in how women are represented in the media and how women engage with their own place in society and become conscious of their own place in society through engaging with media images. And she places that in the unique political situation that characterizes, well, really from the early 20th century China. Her fascinating argument is that one can only really understand the significance of the enormous success of glossy magazines in China if one understands how important images of women have been to changing ideas of Chinese modernity. And the idea that these are not simply fashion images, but images that really matter is really exemplified by this image from Chinese Vogue. Fascinating story. A model who was actually discovered whilst being an international student in London. And this particular image, which was published by Vogue, was the site of considerable controversy about about the image itself and what it said about norms of beauty and issues of race and so on and so forth. But this image caused a great deal of controversy where people were talking about what does it mean to have images of Chinese women as fashion models circulated within a global media economy. And this conversation is brought to you by the Global Times, which is an English language Chinese based newspaper which has a relationship with the CCP. This is interesting in and of itself because it's quite clear that in seizing on this image and talking about the reasons why this image might be objectionable, what we see here is this clear politicization of images of Chinese women. And so what we see is that these kinds of images of changing types of Chinese women, and this is a particular type of Chinese woman, the highly mobile, multicultural Chinese woman, the sort of woman that we are meeting increasingly, as through well, up until COVID at least, very frequently in through student exchanges and those sorts of things. That the fact that we suddenly have, for example, generations of Chinese women who are geographically mobile, who are wanting to engage with different images of themselves. This speaks to real historical shifts in Chinese society, which are also politically sensitive. Okay, so these images of what it means to have images like this are very much related to political questions about what it means to be Chinese. So there's a real solid reason why, if you're, the idea is that the idea I'm trying to get across is that research topics don't fall out of the sky. It's not like Chen woke up one morning and went, oh, I think I'll do something on Chinese Vogue magazine because I walked down the street and I saw it and I think it's interesting. There's a real deep historical reason for art for looking at these particular sorts of images. And Chen's argument essentially is that the takeoff of images like this and the takeoff of Chinese Cosmo, Chinese Vogue, and all of those sorts of things can be placed at the end of a history that's been going on since the dawn of the 20th century, that surrounded the changing role of women in Chinese society and the way that that changing role has been highly politicized. So let's look a little bit more further at her argument. So here we have some different images from different ages from the last 120 years or so. And what Chen argues is that images of women in China since the turn of the 20th century have changed in response to important political changes in Chinese society. So, first, we have the growth of modernity. Beginning in the 20th century and the emergence of China as a modern society, where images of Chinese women are seen as being a really important index of this shift. And then we have an image here from 1907 of Qin Jin, who is an early Chinese feminist heroine who protested against things like foot binding, protested against the Qing dynasty, and was executed for her political activism in 1907. But very much this would be an image of the modern 20th century pre-revolution Chinese woman. And then what Chen argues is that after the revolution, we begin to see images of Chinese women being changed to fit a revolutionary role. So we have this idea of Chinese of socialist realism, where the image of the Chinese woman as the diligent worker, leader, community, kind of the glue that holds communities together. And we have here a woman leading a workers' delegation in 1957. But this idea of the Chinese woman as a socialist revolutionary. And then what Chen argues is that the growth of glossy magazines like Vogue and Cosmopolitan is only really possible with the historical shift to what she calls post-socialism. This is the idea that I suppose after 1989, the idea that we have China shifting towards more of an accommodation with Western capitalism, where women are, I suppose, freer, if that's the word you want to use, to explore their identities as individuals and in relation to consumer culture. Now, of course, Chen is very critical of this consumer culture. I suppose she argues that you're kind of well, it's a very limited notion of freedom, the ability to buy things. But her point is that, of course, that this argument is made in the West. The idea that the notion of female emancipation and individualism has closely been related to consumer society in the West, and that's a very kind of shallow way of understanding liberation, because obviously apart from anything else, that form of liberation, of emancipation, is only available to women who have the financial resources to explore it. So it's kind of a false form of emancipation, and of course it falls into the logic of consumer capitalism. But Chen points out that because of the unique historical situation in China, consumer capitalism in China doesn't really mean the same thing. That consumer culture is a way of thinking about how Chinese women want their lives and their images and their possibilities to change in a post-socialist context. But in any case, what we see in these images from Chinese Vogue is an example of hegemony. It's not a sense of values being imposed on people. It's that Chinese Vogue and Chinese Glossies are kind of a place where Chinese society and Chinese women becomes conscious of struggles within China about what it means to be a Chinese woman, where there are competing stories at play. And of course, this is important because this recognition that consumer messages from Vogue take on a different meaning in the Chinese context, particularly one that's emerging from the discourses of modernity and socialist realism. This is an important part of de-Westernizing media studies. Okay, so the idea that it's important to be conscious that we may be able to say that there's a global struggle for gender equality, but that takes different forms in relation to different political contexts. So Chen's done all of this basically by looking at the history of Chinese women's magazines, the history of Vogue magazine, and pulling out, I suppose, exemplary images from Vogue and Cosmopolitan in China to construct her argument about hegemony. But what can we say the method is here? Well, I suppose what we could say in regard to methodological language is that this is Chen provides us with a thick description of an extreme case. What does this mean? It means that she's giving an incredibly rich historical analysis of Chinese women's magazines, what they featured and why they happened, and she's also using them as kind of extreme cases in the sense that the thing that unites revolutionary and post socialist images of Chinese women is, I suppose, that they are very openly politicized. They are read as being political. They are clearly political in a way that images of women in the West aren't really. So the political aspect, so it's an extreme case in the sense that the political aspects of representations of Chinese women are very, very close to the surface and at times have been subject to direct political intervention in ways that doesn't really happen in most of the other parts of the world. And I suppose the other thing is that what Chen is really trying to do here is she's using history and feminist theory to talk about how texts reflect and refract real social changes. What that means is that you'll spot reflects and refracts. This is a common phrase that's used to explain how media affect reality. The idea that media take the real social world, real social conditions, and kind of bend them and mold them into a particular version, which in turn influences how we understand the world. Um, Chen is arguing that this is what's going on with representations of Chinese women in different forms of popular magazines directed at Chinese women, both those magazines which are produced at home and those magazines which are developed in partnership with outside organizations. So again, what she's trying to do is she's taking a series of examples of magazines and magazine images, and she's building a historical narrative around them using history and theory to explain how they're connected and also to explain how it's reasonable for us to think that these images reflect important changes that are happening in Chinese society.